Over the years, we've heard some incredible Porsche-related car stories here at VINwiki. Porsche makes some amazing cars that are known to be fast, reliable, and can lead to some very entertaining adventures, the recipe for a good car story. Well, you might be saying, Ed, I can't have a Porsche-related car story because I don't have a Porsche. Well, have we got an opportunity for you? The sponsor of today's video is Omaze. Omaze gives you the chance to win some of the most incredible cars on earth by supporting some truly great charitable organizations. And today they're giving you the chance to win a brand new 2021 Porsche 911 Turbo S. It's one of the greatest performance cars that you can buy today, going 0 to 60 in 2.6 seconds thanks to its 640 horsepower twin-turbo flat-six engine and its 8-speed PDK gearbox. It's an amazing car, and I know you'd love to have that along with the $20,000 in cash that they're including. And you become eligible to win by donating to support an amazing charitable organization, in this case, the International Medical Corps. The International Medical Corps is a global first responder that delivers emergency medical care and training to those affected by conflict, disaster, and disease. They provide disaster relief based on the most urgent needs, which can include dispensing medical supplies and hygiene kits, mobilizing medical teams, and offering mental health support while remaining flexible to address other needs as they arise. Donations can help the International Medical Corps to establish an emergency response drawdown fund to support the launch of emergency responses and provide fast and effective humanitarian aid to ensure the most impactful relief for the most vulnerable. For as little as $10, you can support the International Medical Corps and get your chance to win this amazing Porsche. So please visit the link in the description below, omaze.com/VINwiki, for your chance to win, support a great cause, and thank them for their support of VINwiki. So today, here are our top 10 VINwiki Porsche-related car stories.
Like the CHP was like ready to be activated to hunt down this car. So I did that video on the Whittington Brothers 935 winning Le Mans, and the story actually continued after that. Now it didn't have anything to do with drug smuggling or anything like that, but it was a prank that only millionaires can play on billionaires, kind of a thing. The Whittington Brothers will always be connected to this Le Mans winning car, and their illegal exploits will always be connected to them. So they got in trouble again, as you know, adrenaline junkies do, even in their 60s and 70s. And their business got indicted by the DEA. They were still flying planes suspiciously from Colombia, or leasing them, or something was going on out of Florida. And they were running a lot of money through their daughter's spa in Colorado, and things were happening. And the government finally was like, oh, come on, guys. You know, you did this 20 years ago. What are you doing? This investigation began into the Whittington Brothers again in the 2000s. Now, at this point, the car had been restored by Canepa, and it was owned by the amazing Bruce Meyer, one of the greatest collectors, nice guys on the planet. He had just taken a delivery of it, and he's in love with it, and of course he should be. And they want to take it to a track day to actually put it on the track and drive the K3 really for the first time on a racetrack, on race tires, instead of just on a lawn showing it off for a show. His friends, Bruce Canepa and a few other guys, came up with a prank. And what the prank essentially was, and only about 8 or 9 people knew about it, and I was one of them to help set it up, was that we were going to set up the conceit that the DEA still thought that the Whittington Brothers owned the 935. Now, it had been established years earlier in a heated battle between the Indianapolis Museum, who owned it at the time, and the Whittington Brothers, that the Indy Museum owned it. And the Whittington Brothers had just loaned it, and it was this real tense situation between the two of them. Meyer ended up buy/trading it from the Indy Museum, so he owned it now. So the conceit was that the DEA was coming for it to impound it because they were impounding all of the Whittington Brothers' possessions. So we set this whole thing up with Hollywood actors, props, fake DEA cars, badges, guns, everything. So the day of the track day comes at Laguna Seca. We bring the car down, and even the Canepa Motorsport crew Most of them are not in on what's going on. They're prepping the car, and we got it all ready, and I take it for a spin. And he comes back, and, everybody's congratulating him on how amazing the car is. Then down through the paddock pulls 2 black Dodge Chargers with no license plates, and a black Suburban, and a flatbed truck. And these guys get out, and they've got, they're all vested and all wearing black, and they got the one badge hanging around their neck, and it's all real DEA prop stuff. It's the real deal. The lead actor who played the lead DEA agent had formerly been a lawyer, so he could really talk the talk. And he got out and he goes, "I'm looking for Bruce Meyer. I'm looking for Bruce Meyer. Where's Bruce Meyer?" And people are like, over there? And Bruce comes over, and he's like, "How can I help you?" And this whole experience only proves that this guy is like a 100% nice guy. Because anybody else would have freaked out. They're like, "Sir, we're here to impound your car. It's a $3 million car. How much is worth at the time?" And he's like, "We need to take your car. We're taking it into possession. I've got a receipt for you." And he's all, "Please identify the car." They didn't take the front end off so we could see where the stamps were for the identification numbers, and they're checking things off. And all the time, and Meyer's like, "Well, I don't really understand what's going on, but I want to work with you." He's being really, really nice, but he's a little concerned. And everybody there's freaking out. Like, the cops are here to take away this car. He's totally cool. His son is in on it, and his son comes over and he's all like, "I don't know, Dad. We probably should let him take it because otherwise that we're obstructing the law and things like that." And he's like, "Yeah, I think you're right." So maybe it all happened within like 15 minutes. Meanwhile, the DEA agents are having them load this thing on a standard flatbed. Now, this car is only like 1.5 inches off the ground. And the motorsport guys are like, "I don't even know how to do this." So it was like every piece of scrap wood and plywood that they could find, and they're squeezing it on this. Like, it's the same kind of wrecker you would have to pick up your car on the side of the road. It wasn't anything special. And they're pulling it and dragging it up, and it's scraping as it's going up. And everybody who's been restoring it is kind of freaking out. And they get it up there, and the tow truck guy's like, "I don't even know how to tie this down." So the motorsport guys tie it down to his truck. The lead guy finishes the paperwork, tears off a receipt for a $3 million car, gives it to Bruce Meyer. Meyer's like, "Well, thanks. How do I follow up on this?" He's like, "Well, just call the number and we'll call you, and we're going to put it in impound, but it's your car, and we'll make sure that all the paperwork's done correctly." He's like, "Oh," and they all line up. They get back in their cars and they all take off. And it happened so fast. It was so beautifully done. The woman who coordinated all this did an amazing job. And it all just went off seamlessly. And you could see after the car kind of disappeared off the track that Meyer started being like a little uncomfortable. Like, you could see he's like, "Okay, all right." And he's trying to be cool about it. So he makes a phone call to, this is my understanding, he called, he's on the board for the California CHP. And I think he called the head of the CHP, the general of the CHP, or whoever that person is, and be like, "Does this sound right to you? Because, they impounded my car," and apparently the guy's like, "No. Like, did you get this guy's information?" He's like, "I got a receipt and this information." He's all like, "What do the vehicles look like?" And he's like, So they put out like an APB statewide for this truck and his car and these DEA trucks. Now, they had just gone to the outside perimeter road of the track and parked. But the CHP was ready to be activated to hunt down this car. And Meyer's like, "Okay, we'll see how it goes." And as it started just careening out of control, because Meyer is one of the most well-connected car collectors around. Easily could have called just about anybody to have this all taken care of. Over comes Bruce and his friends, and they're kind of like, "Gotcha!" And you could just see his face go, "Huh?" And we have video of it. He's half smiling, half like, "What just happened?" And while he was on the phone, they called for the truck to come back. And it rolls back into the paddock, and he just bursts out laughing. And he thought it was the funniest thing that had ever happened. So one would expect maybe there's retaliation. And vengeance is best served cold, right? That's the old saying. And I think every single one of those guys has been waiting all these years for something to happen. I don't think nothing's happened since then. But they have to have in the back of their minds, every time something slightly out of the ordinary happens, they got to be thinking, Meyer's coming for me. Like, it's got, it has to happen. They got to be thinking about it because it was such an elaborate, beautifully played prank. And all of those guys have the same kind of assets that Meyer has that are out there and doing things. So it's quite possible. I quite certainly hope it happens again. This prank cost $50,000 if it was a penny, just to have fun and play with Bruce Meyer. But it was hilarious. I mean, that's how millionaires play pranks on billionaires. You just steal their $3 million car and then maybe give it back.
The car, who's behind me, I think I'm gonna get pulled over for racing him, turns on his lights. He is a police officer. I'd finally gotten what at this point was my dream car. I was 18, I got a 911, black 911, black interior, some sport package type upgrades like 19-inch sport wheels. It wasn't a Carrera S, just a Carrera 911 convertible. And I'd spent like 2 years making this my perfect car, or I guess a year at that point. Now that's anything from like different intakes to a different exhaust system to painting the wheels, all sorts of things like that. So I babied this car. And I always explain to my family that these cars go faster, but they're also safer in most cases, in my opinion. Now, whether that's you can stop where you want, you can speed around something if you need to, or whatever the case may be, I think they're safer. And I got the chance to prove that during an unfortunate incident involving myself and a nice Kia who decided to come greet me in an intersection. But I was driving along and I just passed through the intersection of Powers Ferry and Delk. And it's maybe 10 p.m., so it's really dark out. And I see this guy start to turn as I'm passing through the intersection. And I'm like, please don't do this in my mind. And it was really close to being a lot worse, and this kind of proves my point, because here I am coming straight on as he's turning. And I'm thinking, I'm about to get in a head-on collision, great. And I'm going 45 or so, that's not gonna be fun. And so, luckily, I can hit the brakes, I turn the steering wheel right so that I'm pointed this way all of a sudden, and he ends up sliding down the side of my car. So I did evade a head-on collision, but he still slides down the side of my car while I'm going 45. So I spin out, end up smashing into the curb, breaking off the back two wheels, completely messing up the car. The transmission, the neutral position was completely sideways after that. You couldn't even go to first gear or reverse or anything. Car was destroyed. In the moment, I can remember all I was thinking was, I'm gonna have to spend like 2 hours cleaning my car now, like detailing it. That wasn't true at all. That car is just done. But you think very strange things in those moments. And so I really think that car saved my life. Like maybe not life, but saved me from a lot worse injuries. Now I walked away with like a concussion and some neck pain, but at the same time, I didn't just go from 45 to 0 in 1 second. I evaded him and spun out. I took a few months trying to figure out the next car, because I'm always thinking about like, well, what car am I gonna get next, whether I'm about to get another car or not. And of course, I got another 911, just a newer 911. I said, okay, I've had a convertible manual 2006 997.1. Why don't I get just a hardtop PDK double clutch transmission 997.2? So I go to a 2009 car, white, and I start to do some modifications to it, get the same spiel, exhaust, wheels, things like that. And I love this car. Now, I think I had calmed down a little bit in driving since the last car, because at that point, I was never going extremely fast. But I started commuting a lot. So I go to Georgia Tech, I'm 20, but I have a company called Stored. We're a logistics company. We sell warehousing and distribution nationwide, use third-party warehouses to fulfill the service. And we got some investors from a program in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which, depending on how you're driving, can only be like an hour and 15 minutes to 2 hours. All depends on the person and where you're leaving from. And I start commuting here every week, coming back because I'm at Georgia Tech, and I just start racking up the miles like crazy on this car. And of course, every time I'm trying to maximize how much time I have in each city, so I'm leaving at like 10, 11 p.m. at night to get back to Chattanooga or to get back to Atlanta, and very tired, just trying to get there. And so I had just gotten this car, and I was on the way back to Chattanooga one night. And keep in mind, I had never had a ticket, nothing. I'm very lucky. And so here I was driving back to Chattanooga. It was pouring down rain like crazy, and it stopped, and I was cleared up all of a sudden. So traffic died down. I was like, okay, I can actually get there in a timely manner. So I started speeding up, and this car, who to date, I swear I've never seen another car like it. I don't know what model it was. It was a Chevy something. Just pulls up next to me for a while. And I'm probably going 85, 90, like fast, but not crazy, not racing anyone or anything like that. And this whole time, the funniest part is that I'm on the phone, and amidst my conversation, we were discussing that I was trying to get back to Chattanooga fast, and I was like, well, I've never gotten a ticket. I really wonder what would happen if I got pulled over. Would I get a ticket? Would I be able to talk myself out of it? Will it be for really fast or slow? And so I'm still on the phone, and this guy's just going neck and neck with me forever. And I don't pay much attention to him because he's speeding. Finally, I'm like, okay, I don't like to drive next to people. I don't like people on my tail. I'm just gonna speed off a little bit and lose them, maybe find some other traffic, so that we're not just sitting next to each other. And I go off, and eventually he catches me, and he comes up behind me this time. And I think the car is silver, so I'm like, what is this guy doing? Why is he so inclined to be right next to me on this 100-mile trip we're going on right now? And we're approaching Tennessee, probably 30 miles from it at this point. And this guy keeps following me. He's right on me, whether I go into another lane, cut between a car, he comes around right next to me and gets behind me again, or gets next to me. And if he was only behind me, I might have thought it was strange, but he still is just coming neck and neck with me sometimes, but normally staying just right behind me, like very close behind me. And so I keep thinking, what is this guy doing? Why won't he leave me alone? And he's been next to me speeding for probably 30 minutes or something now. And I'm like, all right, I've gone from anything from 60 to 95 trying to lose this guy, and he won't leave me alone. I don't know why. Who knows why? And so finally I'm like, you know what? I'm just gonna lose him. I'm just gonna hit the gas, get out of here, never see him again, and it's gonna be a lot easier tonight. And I'm still on the phone. And I think my words were, if I get pulled over because someone thinks I'm racing this guy who won't leave me alone, I'm gonna be very mad. And that was not the case. So he's still on me. I think he's trying to race or something. I'm in a Porsche, he's in a Chevy, or who knows, I don't remember. And I'm like, okay, I just gotta lose this guy who thinks we're having fun. So I hit on the gas, start going, probably going 105, 110, just trying to get him out of my sight. But he's staying right on me. Now, I'm faster than him, so I'm losing him a little bit, but he's ultimately staying right on me no matter how fast I'm going. And I'm just like, why? Okay, I'll go a little bit faster. And finally, I don't know how fast, the car, who's behind me, I think I'm gonna get pulled over for racing him, turns on his lights. He is a police officer. Not, I'm gonna see a police officer. This is the police officer that I'm worried about right now, who's seen everything I've done for the past 30 minutes, trying to lose him, trying to speed off. So I'm like, am I gonna go to jail? Is he just gonna give me citations for probably 30 things he's now seen me do within the past 20, 30 minutes that he has on camera? What is his ultimate goal right now? Like, why was he baiting me to go faster? And I'm just like, great. I'm still under 21, so a super speeder can mean 6 months without a license. And I'm like, this is not gonna be good. I still have to do this drive every week. And so I pull off at the next exit. Nobody's around us at all. He pulls up right behind me, and he does not waste any time. The second we stop, he jumps out, closes his door, and just walks straight up to the window. He doesn't even, I don't think he looks up the license plate or anything. Maybe he had already, but he just came right up to the car, no hesitation. He goes, what in the world are you doing? And I was kind of awestruck by that question. Like, I thought he would say, hey, I got you going however fast. But no, he just said, what in the world are you doing? And it probably was not the most rational response of mine, or probably the best thing to say to a police officer, so I would not advise it. But I go, well, what are you doing? Why were you on my tail for so long? I thought you could have been a crazy person. Like, you can't just follow someone like that, baiting them to go faster or think you're trying to follow them or something. So I'm trying to lose you. He goes, listen, I started following you because you were speeding. That doesn't count as an excuse. And so here I am, like, I mean, he's not wrong. The most I can do is try to like get him on a friendly note now. But that's not what happens. The conversation ends up being like a minute, maximum maybe. Because after that he just says, listen, clearly I'm an unmarked police car. I'm not out here to give traffic tickets, but I can, and you're on video. I'm not out here to give traffic tickets. I'm just trying to get home. And meanwhile I'm thinking, okay, it's only like 5 miles to Tennessee. Cutting it close, I could have lost him. I'm not out here to give traffic tickets, but I can. Listen, just slow down. It just rained. Like, it's dangerous out, it's dark. It's not good for you to speed right now. Now, that's all sound logic. Yes, he was correct that the conditions were not the best. And so maybe he was doing me a service by pulling me over. And anyways, he says, just slow down. And so in my mind, I'm like, does that mean no speeding ticket? Like, what? So can we get a warning at least, like at most a warning or something? But no, nothing. He just says, just slow down. And he walks back and gets in his car. And the funniest part is I still was on the phone. This all happens over like 30 minutes. So my girlfriend heard the whole conversation, thought it was hilarious. I'm like, well, that answers that question. I didn't get a ticket or lose my license. So I get back in the car and I pull up, and now I'm at this light waiting to get back on the on-ramp onto the highway, and I look up and all of a sudden I realize, oh, you have to turn left or right. It won't let you go straight here. And so at that point I turn on my blinker, and all of a sudden I hear over a speakerphone behind me, this cop car, all right, listen, if you just go slowly, I'll let you proceed through the intersection and go straight, just do it safely. Like, roll on the window, wave out, thank you. I'm like, oh, this cop's my friend now. And so I get on and get back on the highway, and of course, he still follows me and then finally turns off. And my only takeaway was, I guess it's only okay to speed, break the law, go through an intersection when you're not supposed to, if the cop is there to give you permission and do it himself as well.
I mean, if you ever want to feel like a shrewd negotiator, start sniffing around a car that's about to have its second birthday on a car lot. Early in 2012, we got an email from Lamborghini as a dealer with a list of cars from their inventory that they wanted to sell. And we would get these about quarterly with different press cars or show cars or cars that they own for whatever reason. And in this case, one of the cars on the list was a Giallo Midas 2008 Gallardo Superleggera. Really high option car, all the carbon, ceramic brakes, big wing, nav, everything you'd want. But the car had been bought back under lemon law. And it had some check engine light recurring issue that they had trouble fixing initially, but since then they had fixed it and they owned the car. Obviously it was a buyback with a branded title for lemon law, and they were selling it. And generally dealers don't like these sorts of things. You know, the cars can't have their warranties extended. They're usually impossible to finance, and there's just less demand for them. So usually when you see a branded title car like that, you're going to want to pay 30 or 40% less than you normally would. And at the time, a nice 2008 Superleggera was probably a 120, 130 car. I mean, this was certainly a low mile, great looking example with no cosmetic issues, but it had this issue with its past. And so I thought there was a pretty good chance this thing was going to go pretty cheap, maybe 70, 80 grand. And at the time, I had been daily driving the prostitute Gallardo. I'd had it for about a year, probably put about 10, 11,000 miles on it. Was just loving it. I mean, literally, I'd sold my other Mercedes at the time and I drove it every single day. At the time, my wife had a 2004 Cayenne S, and we would drive that when we needed more space or we're going out with some friends or whatever the case may be. But most of the time, I just drove the Lamborghini, certainly every day to work, and I just grown to love it. I mean, you know, it certainly was not perfect. I think at one point it had 8 or 9 different error lights on at the same time, but I had generally avoided all the monsters in the closet, you know, the pitfalls of cheap exotic car ownership. I'd paid 30 grand to buy it and about 20 grand to fix it up, and since then hadn't really had to spend any more money on it. The car was great, and I was kind of thinking, it's probably about time to start looking for whatever's next. I mean, as car guys, we never stop shopping and just looking out for something new, and so this Superleggera seemed like a great option. But I was not in a position to own both, so in order to be able to bid on it, I had to sell the prostitute Gallardo. And obviously I was in a good position with the car. I mean, I was gonna make some money on it, but it was kind of like the last quarter of an Alabama football game. I mean, you know how it's gonna end, you just don't know how impressive it's gonna be. And so I kind of started asking around, and I ended up selling it for 75,000 bucks to a California dealer that I knew pretty well and had sold a bunch of cars to. So the car shipped out, and I knew that what I could spend on this Superleggera. So the auction came up, and I bid my 70 grand, went up to 75, and then 80, and there was just a lot more interest on it than I had ever anticipated. And at the time, most of the interest was in the LP 570 cars that had just come out and were kind of all the rage. We sold those like crazy, and so the 08s were really unappreciated, and particularly, with this kind of title issue, I thought, man, why do so many people want this car? And I've really got to buy it, or else I'm going to be in a little bit of a pickle here. And so it kept going up, and I bid up to about 90, 91 grand, and it just kept flying. The thing ended up selling for like $120,000. And it didn't really make sense because somebody could have gone out and bought a really, really perfect example without a branded title for that. But regardless, I did not end up buying the car, and I was without anything to drive. But fortunately, a few months prior to that, we had finally sold our first Lotus Evora. I mean, since then we'd sold many of them, but the first one we got that was our original demo was a silver car, kind of low options, just kind of a boring spec, and nobody had ever wanted it. And we'd had it for about 2 years at that point, and I think we put a couple dashes in it from the leather shrinking and given its normal electrical problems, and it really solved most of the normal Evora issues at that point, but we had just never found anybody who really wanted to own it. And we had this guy walk in with the roughest looking Porsche Cayenne that you could ever imagine. And he starts looking at this car. And I mean, if you ever want to feel like a shrewd negotiator, start sniffing around a car that's about to have its second birthday on a car lot. You're going to get whatever you want and feel like a rock star in negotiating. And so he came into my office and wanted to talk about the car, and we went out and drove it, and he really, really liked it. But then we kind of got to his trade. He had this Cayenne, and he said he'd bought it a few months before that at an auction in Miami. And at the time, he didn't realize that it had a Florida certificate of destruction. So in this case, the car was in a flood, and the insurance company decided that it was not worth putting back together. So it was not a rebuildable salvage. It had a certificate of destruction. It was only valuable for parts or scrap. And he didn't know that, and he'd bought it for way too much money, probably bidding against the refrigerator at some big salvage auction, moving really fast, and guys like him just get in over their heads and they buy something like this that they can't use. And so it still had some paper tag from some hole-in-the-wall dealer in Florida, and he had been driving it a little bit, but was kind of worried, he couldn't really get insurance for it or anything like that. And so he needed to trade this thing, and he said, the only way I can buy this Lotus is if my wife thinks that I got all my money back for this Porsche. And I was like, I kind of hemmed and hawed, like, that's a big ask. I mean, obviously the thing's not worth $10,000 or whatever he wanted for it. And I said, let me go talk to my manager. Let's just see if we can figure something out. And so I walked into it, and I hadn't even closed the door behind me when he said, do whatever he wants, just get the car out of here. And I knew that would be the outcome. And so I went out there and talked to him a little bit, maybe even got a little bump out of him. And he ends up buying this Evora. So we end up owning, as a dealership, this absolutely useless Cayenne. It was white with a gray interior. I mean, rough in every way one could be. Scratches on every panel, all the bumpers dented, dings everywhere, wheels all curved up, tires just about bald. I mean, every error light that you could imagine being on for a car that was underwater for a little while. And this was not like it drove through a deep puddle. I mean, this thing smelled like the basement of a water treatment plant in Detroit. And it was probably half as safe to be in. And so as a dealer, you have the option of just selling it off and obviously taking the loss on paper because it was only going to bring probably 3 or 4 grand at an auction. Or we just kept it around. I mean, people would run errands in it. It was just kind of this thing that nobody had to worry about. And it would drive around even though it smelled awful and felt bad and wasn't the most reliable of things. I mean, at the time, my wife's Cayenne had been a brilliant car for us, but it was pretty heavy on maintenance. I mean, it chewed through brakes and tires about every 10,000 miles. And I think they were on like the 20th revision of the coil pack for those early Cayennes because they kept fouling coils. And so we'd had done a lot to ours, and I loved the thing. And this one obviously needed all those things, but Porsche wasn't going to goodwill or warranty even one of these older cars that had these common issues, especially if it had been in a flood. And so there was never really anything that got done to the car. I mean, we must have driven it, I don't know, 15, 20,000 miles without even changing the oil. Like, nobody really cared about it until one day I think our service manager came to us and said, hey, do you mind if I put some brakes and tires on that car? I mean, I think it's starting to get dangerous. And I mean, it was well past a treacherous car to drive, but you know, as a sales department, we were his favorite customer because he'd always bill way too much for whatever it was. And I think he ended up putting like $2,500, $3,000 worth of tires and brakes on this thing. And I mean, the car wasn't worth that altogether, but regardless, you know, the car became a little bit nicer to drive. And so when I was without a car and needed something, I asked my boss, hey, can I drive the Cayenne for a little while? And I was out looking, you know, searching, but you know, when you want to find these high mile, multiple accidents, sordid past, poorly kept, bad option, just really rough examples of interesting cars, they don't grow on trees. I mean, you got to search all the corners of the internet. So I was using things like Auto Tempest to find weird Craigslist listings and trying to find that, you know, needle in a haystack, that really cool, rough car that fit my normal buying criteria. And I was having no luck. I think I ended up driving this Cayenne for about 3 months, just combing everywhere I could look, looking for trades that we might get something interesting to buy and making offers that were probably really insulting on different things, and just had never had any luck. And at the time, my boss was really interested in me finding something to replace the prostitute Gallardo with, because I was a pretty worthless employee for a little while because all of my time was just spent looking for personal cars. So he didn't mind me driving the Cayenne by any means, but he was ready for me to get back to my normal routine of selling a whole bunch of interesting cars. So he would, you know, send me trades or ideas or say, hey Ed, why don't you just buy this thing? And generally they weren't quite rough enough. The Cayenne was great to have, and I would certainly appreciated the opportunity, but man, it was a hard car to drive. I mean, it wouldn't idle. So most of the time as you decelerated to stop the car from dying, you had to throw it into neutral and keep propping the throttle up by blipping the pedal and just, you know, hope that you could throw it back into drive reasonably smoothly and get the car to move. But, you know, again, every error light was on, but it, you know, just put gas in it and drive, and it would get me where I wanted to go most of the time. And so I drove it for a while, and it was just a lot of fun. You never have to worry about anything in this car. You park it anywhere and, you know, go over a curb if you have to. Nobody really worries about it. But eventually I did finally find 2 cars that I wanted to buy, and I ended up getting them both. I got a huge loan for my first LP640, an orange Roadster, and loved that car. And I also bought the 2004 CL55 that we ended up using about a year later to set the Cannonball record. And so the Cayenne was just that perfect stopgap, you know, that car when you need it, and it was just a lot of fun. You know, I love cars that look great from, you know, 20 or 30 feet. This might have been more like a 100-footer before you'd really learn that it was a piece of garbage. But, you know, I think a couple of years later, they ended up selling the thing to one of our wholesalers when it was finally time to take the loss. I mean, back in 2012, each month was kind of touch and go. So the idea of putting a $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 loss on the books for this car was not in the cards. But they did finally move it, and you know, it was just fun, good memories in a bad car. But I hope all car enthusiasts at some point get the chance to spend some time in a really bad example of a really cool car and just, you know, guiltlessly go out and drive it, not worry about a thing and have a blast and just really get to experience it without any concern whatsoever. Sometimes, in fact, they do the shrewd negotiation for you preemptively. As we talk about the art of shrewd negotiation, one of the main tenets is convincing the seller that some issue with their car is a way bigger deal than they think it is, and that that's somehow going to impact the rest of the market, limit your competition, and allow you to buy the car at a lower price than hopefully you can sell it to the next guy. And that can sometimes be an awkward and difficult process because people are fond of their cars and they've convinced themselves that they're worth the moon, and it can be hard to convince them that something is really that bad about them. But sometimes it isn't. Sometimes, in fact, they do the shrewd negotiation for you preemptively, and they just offer the car too cheap for sale. And that's what happened to me last week. On Tuesday morning early, I got a text from Doug Tabbitt, and he said, message this guy, tell him you'll wire money immediately and buy this car. So that sounds interesting, and there was a RenList link in the text message. RenList is a popular Porsche message board, and so I clicked on it, and there was a gorgeous 1995 Porsche 993. And it had an extensive mod list that was well documented. It looked kind of like an RS tribute car, so lots of cool little things. It looked a lot better than your normal 993. all of which have appreciated a lot in the last years because they kind of represent the last generation of the air-cooled 911. And so they've all skyrocketed in value, and I've always loved the lines of them, but I kind of assumed that they were all kind of out of reach at this point, or at least more than I could sort of justify for what the car is. But the asking price on the car was $35,000, and that was way cheaper than something that looked that good normally should be, certainly with all the stuff that was done to it. I mean, there was probably 25 or 30 grand worth of mods listed that this guy had installed during his 9 years of ownership. But the reason the car was cheap was because of a story. And I love story cars, but when I asked Doug why he didn't want the car, he said that was it. He loves selling no story cars that have no excuses, need no excuses, and like he said in a recent video, he just always advises people to buy the best car they possibly can afford. The complete opposite of my general strategy in car buying. And the story on this car was that a few months after he had bought the car in 2009, he had taken it to a PCA track event. And unfortunately, but like many 911 owners on track, he found himself sliding backwards into a tire wall. And it had broken the rear bumper and the taillights and wrinkled the fenders a little bit, done a bit of damage. And unfortunately, he didn't have track insurance, but since it wasn't a timed event, he got State Farm, his insurer at the time, to cover the car. And they had fixed the car and done a good job, and he was happy with it and continued to drive it for the next 9 years. Obviously, there was an insurance claim. It had shown up and Carfax had it. But a few years after that, after 2013, when he rechecked the Carfax, it now showed that the car was totaled. And obviously that wasn't the case. He still had the original title issued before the car had been in the accident. But there wasn't really anything he could do to clarify that. And in his head, he had blown that so far out of proportion that he undervalued the car. And he thought that the next buyer might get a salvage title when they registered it or something like that, and that this was just going to be something that just alienated all the prospective buyers from the car. And obviously he was not correct, because the replies were already kind of rolling in of people who had questions about it. But I immediately sent him a message and said, hey, as long as the car is what you said it is, I want it. I'll take the car, no questions asked. I don't need a PPI. It seems like a fair price, and I understand the story. In fact, it's exactly what had happened to me on a Ferrari 612 that I had for my rental car company. An accident that didn't total the car was later reinterpreted by Carfax, and they labeled it as having been a total loss. So I get the issue. I'm fine with the story. Don't worry about that. I'll make the deal easy on you. Just let me know how you want to proceed. And a couple hours later, Doug pinged me back. He said, hey, did you hear back from the seller? Did you get the car? I said, well, not yet, but I logged back into Renlist, and he had sent me a message back and said, hey, I'm going through all the inquiries and everybody who's interested. Here's my email address. Let's kind of move the conversation over there. So I immediately sent him an email. I said, great, just so we're clear, I'm ready to go. The money's ready to wire. I don't need financing, no PPI. Let me know what you want to do logistically and we'll get it done. Everything will be easy. So a couple hours later, he calls me. He seems just exhausted. Obviously, he's been bombarded by inquiries and people interested. In fact, I think he said there had been 27 inquiries from people interested in the car in like the 15 hours the ad had been live, and that I was the first of 12 to have said that kind of same circumstance. I'll take the car right now. You're asking price, no questions asked, wire money now. But he did say, I want to call everybody. I owe them all that they've inquired about my car. I'm just going to go through all the emails and respond to everybody. I said, well, is there anything anyone else can say or do that puts them in front of me? Because I want the car. I want to make sure it's mine. He said, no, I just owe them the courtesy. So a couple hours later, he called me back and he said, all right, I've got through everybody. I've told them that they're not first in line, so that as long as you just do what you've said you're going to do, the car is yours. I said, terrific. So this was Tuesday late at night. I said, I'll come up tomorrow, Wednesday if you want me to. But Thursday's a little bit easier for me. He said, terrific. That's easier on me. I've got tons of stuff, all the original parts, everything that ever went with the car. I'm going to get that all boxed up and I'll have it ready. I said, all right, great. So I sent the wire the next day. He had sent me a copy of the title, his bill of sale, his driver's license, everything you'd ever want to kind of verify a used car purchase remotely. And I set out on Thursday morning with a good friend who has a 993 and he's owned a bunch of Porsches. And we drove up to the southern tip of Indiana where this car was, about 430 miles away from Atlanta. So it was a nice trip up, poured on us most of the time, but just a very exciting thing. Anytime you get a new car, it's great. And I wasn't really planning on buying a Porsche, but like I said before, you kind of have to be ready to buy a whole lot of different cars so that when something like this pops up at a deal that almost seems too good to be true, but then everything sort of checks out, you can move quickly and immediately. So I was really excited just to have something else. I am working on a deal with the Mercy, so it's going to be nice to have something as a stopgap while I work on a replacement. Regardless, it was just going to be something fun to play around with. And I was already getting bombarded by messages and emails and texts and everything else from the other down the line interested parties asking if I wanted to flip it, how much I wanted to not buy it, all these other things, because he had said who was buying the car. So I get up there and the car is immaculate. I mean, just beautiful. I was expecting, you know, you're gonna show up and the paint's really bad or it's really edgy or needs a lot of stuff. And no, the thing was just about perfect. 69,000 miles, super low miles for a 993. And no, at 35 grand, it's not the cheapest one on earth, but I thought that's what you're supposed to title videos as, like Tavares and Hoovy and all the other guys talk about their cheap finds or whatever. But if I go by Lemon's rules and I can sell the original parts or some of the other stuff off it that's extremely valuable, it certainly is cheaper than the, you know, $30,000 to $33,000 cars you can find that have a ton of miles or an automatic gearbox or are just in garbage condition. Because this thing was really, really nice. And I mean, it's clearly worth 45 to 50 grand today, probably 55 to 60 if I can somehow get Carfax to change their tune about what the accident was. And the title is clean and it won't have a salvage title when I go to register it. It passed emissions easily when I got it back to Georgia, and we had just a great drive home in the car. We ran it around the block up there and threw all the stuff in the cars and just headed back, and it drove perfectly. We stopped in Nashville for the night and saw some friends and made it back to Atlanta just fine. I took it to Caffeine and Octane the other day. Everybody's really excited about it. It's got a ton of eyeball. I mean, just a fun car. Not that fast, but just a very pleasant car to be in. Just that quintessential sports car driving feel, very simple mechanically and pretty easy to work on as you need to. And amazingly, unlike almost every other 993 I've ever seen, it doesn't need a motor rebuild for unbelievable oil leaks. I mean, the motor's dry, top and bottom, and it runs just great, sounds really good. It was a really nicely sorted car that he had done some more tracking in, but just had really gone through and kept up very nice. And he had a bunch of other Porsches, a newer GT3 Cup car, a GT4, and was just a super stand-up guy. Just did everything he said he would, by the book, to the T, at the moment he said it was gonna happen. So just a super honorable guy, exactly the kind of person you wanna buy a car from. And that's what I try to do, is just be transparent, do what I say I'm gonna do on both sides of a transaction. And so even when I don't have to do the shrewd negotiation myself, it was super cool to have a great car and get a good deal on it. And I don't know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna drive it for a little while. I'll see what happens with it. You know, maybe I'll sell it eventually, but I see no reason to. They're not going down in value. So maybe I'll hold on to it, drive it some more, throw the keys around to some friends, and who knows, maybe we'll even give it away when we hit 1 million subscribers. I don't know yet, but tell me what you think I should do with the 993, but I can assure you I'll be out driving it and enjoying every mile.
It was like Boogie Nights meets Days of Thunder. So one of my favorite racing stories of all time, and most people really haven't heard of since they're not geeks like me, are the Whittington Brothers. Now the Whittington Brothers were 3 brothers who were into plane racing and adrenaline junkie stuff in the early 70s. And they decided to become sports car racers, because why not, right? And they went to the 1979 24 Hours of Le Mans and got a seat. 2 of them, Bill and his brother, got a seat on the Crummer team. And Crummer was building these special Porsche 935s, slightly modified from the factory with their own little tricks, like an air-to-air intercooler instead of an air-to-water intercooler like the factory car had, which gave them an extra 2 or 3%, which over 24 hours adds up to something. And they were brilliant. And they used to drive their cars from Germany to the track in France to shake them down, which I would love to have seen that. So the Whittington Brothers show up, and I think they bought their seats for like $20,000 each, which was a lot of money then. Like a seat was probably about 10 grand for something. And they didn't care. They go to the first meeting, and Kramer's like, okay, Klaus, their driver, he's gonna go first. And then Bill and so. And they're like, wait. Now, why is your driver going first? Because it's my car, my driver goes first, then you, then you. And I go, what if he crashes? We don't get to drive the car, we spend all the money. He goes, that's racing. And they're like, no. He's like, fine, well, don't drive. And they're like, well, what does it take for us to go first? And lightheartedly, he goes, buy the car. And he was already selling his cars. It was in the business was building and selling race cars. So he threw a crazy number at him, like $200,000, which was more than what the car was worth, just to shut him up. And they go, okay, And he's like, what? I'm like, go back to our trailer, go to the duffel bag, take out $200,000 and not a penny more. And I'm like, okay. So they did. And they went to Le Mans in '79. And they won. Klaus Ludwig, who was the driver for Kremer, did most of the heavy lifting. And he was brilliant. And this was the first production car to win at Le Mans since 1953 when the Jags were running. It was unheard of because the Porsche factory 936s are out there and they're prototypes and there's other prototypes out there running, but it rained. So they had something those prototypes didn't have, windshield wipers. And the car was wicked fast in the rain. And they ended up taking it. And it was huge, absolutely monstrous. And it was the last production car to win, like a street-based production car to win at Le Mans. So Kremer overnight, there's orders for like 12, 14 K3s. And that's what lined up the next year in '80. It was all K3s, like the famous K3 that was the Macintosh sponsored car, like the only car ever sponsored by Apple. They were all out there. So the Kremers are on top of the world. So they're like, great, we want a couple more. And Kremer's like, absolutely, whatever you want. They're like, go back to our trailer, take the rest of the money, and we'll have a couple more of these K3s. So they had brought, an estimate, about $500,000 in cash in 1979 to Le Mans. So where did they get this money, right? And that was always the thing. Like, they operated in a whole nother realm than everybody else. It was found out later, actually, like one of the advantages they had at Le Mans was they were fueling what appeared to be faster than everybody else. And all the fuel outlets are regulated, have regulators on them to only flow at a certain speed, so it's equal for all teams. Well, it turns out they gave some guy like $25,000 cash, which was probably his entire year's salary, for his stamp. And they took the seal off and they adjusted it and they put the stamp on. And so they were filling up twice as fast. I don't know how it happened, it just happened. They were used to working outside the rules and got full into sports car racing. They actually got into NASCAR racing and they got into Indy. And a lot of the cars didn't have a lot of sponsorship on them. Or they had sponsorship that didn't exist. They would make up companies. Like one of the funny stories is that they got girls with perfume bottles to walk around with labels on them and spray people in the pits and say, oh, this is the beautiful new perfume. There was no perfume company. They put labels on another perfume to make it look like they had a sponsor to kind of put people aside. And it was just absolutely brilliant. And they did actually really well. They were talented drivers. So they bought Road Atlanta. And Road Atlanta has a special feature from all the tracks in the United States. This, at that point, had the longest straightaway you could get. Now, they also owned a plane company that you could rent their planes. Now, this is all unofficial history, right? So the planes, one over the top of another, would fly in, one would land on the racetrack, and the other one would fly to a local airport, middle of the night, and unload things. Now, there were these trailers in the back, these container trailers. You see them in all the shots of the track, and you weren't allowed to go out there or have anything to do with them. They were full of pot, like just stacked up, supposedly with marijuana. And it was like, they were running drugs and they're driving cars. It was like Boogie Nights meets Days of Thunder. Like it was just, like it should be a movie. Like it was just absolutely brilliant. They get a couple more cars for the run, and they became this famous yellow 935s that they became. Now the Le Mans winner became one of those cars, and it would go to Daytona. And they took the Le Mans car, and it set a scorching qualifying time, like almost impossible. And when the car was restored a couple of years ago, the sill was obviously, wasn't damaged, but it had been opened. So they opened up the sill and nothing in there. So called the original mechanics for advice on how to restore the car. And they're like, oh, yeah, you found the hole. Like, okay, say more. And they had put a nitrous bottle inside of a K3. Now a K3 made 750 horsepower maybe 800, you turn the boost all the way up. So they were going around Daytona on the banking and hitting the boost, and they'd have over 1,000 horsepower temporarily. And it was quite common. Like they turn a lap, and this monster lap, and they would just come across the finish line, and the car would go and die. And it was it. The engine just melted. It's a $40,000 engine back in the day, right? And teams would take care of them. They'd just take it out, and they'd have another one, they'd slam it in, and go racing. And there were a couple of teams that did, like Danny and Gaius would burn up the Interscope cars. The Interscope was the same way. Like another engine, shove it in the back, everything's fine. Such blatant, spending, such blatant money that was untraceable. People knew they were rich, but no, not quite why. So finally, the government caught up with them. But it wasn't until after they had one of the greatest Indy failures ever. Bill and his brother wanted to go Indy racing. The other brother was like, I want to go too. And he was actually really good. And he qualified really well up towards the front. Coming around, they're in the formation lap, they come around 3, they come around 4, and in Indy they wave the flag and everybody jockeys to the start. He loses it. The younger brother loses it. Takes out everybody. It's a huge calamity. It's one of the great Indy mess ups. Like in '66, when Dan Gurney had the first Eagle crash, and it was like 14 cars crashed, same kind of thing. Just everywhere. And suddenly their name is in the dumps. And Unser comes out and he's ready to punch anybody because he was always ready to punch people. That was kind of the end. That would have been like the perfect end of the movie where everything starts falling apart. They finally got indicted, they go to jail, and the Le Mans car gets given to the Indy Museum. That should have been that. And a lot of stuff was divested and sent away. And when they got out of jail, they're like, oh, no, we didn't give the car to the Indy Museum. We loaned it to them. We'd like it back. And the Indy Museum's like, no. And then a decade-long legal battle went on, and finally the Indy Museum won. But they're still around, and they still have their plane company, which had an investigation about 3 years ago, again. They're absolutely brilliant, but they were such a shining moment of that 70s, 80s IMSA. And IMSA, the joke is that IMSA at the time stood for International Marijuana Smugglers Association. So they were the epitome of that. And someday they need a movie about their life.
I ended up staging a raid. In my rental business, Gotham Dream Cars, I've had 3 cars that have been stolen. 2 of the 3 recovered. One was a car that was abandoned in Jersey City. So it was in a police impound. It was very easy to find. It was a 360 Spider. We went, scooped it up after we proved ownership. Very simple, like no harm, no foul. Maybe a couple little body panels missing or taken off. But like when they realized they stole a Ferrari, they probably brought it in. Like, what the hell are we gonna do with this thing? Get it out of here. They dump it on the street. The Porsche GT3, great car, '07 Porsche GT3. The Porsche GT3 is probably the worst rental car we've ever had because we went through 3 of them in short order. And it's such a great car, but it's stick shift, which is tough. And people were either stealing them or crashing them, and neither of those are good for business. Or they didn't know how to drive them, because it's stick shift and it eliminates 8 out of 10 customers. And that's not a good look when you're trying to keep your utilization up, where people rent the car and they're like, I don't know, I can't even operate it. Business, you learn lessons, and I try to safeguard everything. Like, look, we need to verify, like the most important things you could do when you're renting a car is verifying who's receiving the car is who they say they are, and that they have a valid insurance policy to cover it in case anything happens. What is the male weakness? Yeah, exactly. So the first time we had a car stolen or legitimately stolen, never recovered, was a woman coming into Florida claiming to be a Hungarian porn star. Well, boom, my eyes light up, my ears light up. She's got features being flaunted. It's tough for a bunch of young guys, which I was up in New York at the time, but a bunch of young guys that I have employed. If you're in your 20s and a girl walks in and says like, I'm a Hungarian porn star, blah, 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 blah. I can't wait. I love to drive this car. And like, I'll never forget, she stalled the car out on the way out, they told me, and then like, she's like, oh, it's good, and like waved to them as she drove off. Rented the car for 2 weeks, paid cash. She said when she came back, she was gonna bring some of her porn materials to give the guys. So nobody thought anything of it. And when you're going to steal a car, it makes sense to start with a legitimate transaction, as long as the transaction is anonymous to an extent. I think we got about $15,000 from them, between probably a $5,000 rental for 2 weeks, probably $2,500 a week for the GT3, and then a $10,000 security deposit. And when a customer has a car, we leave them alone. Like, I'm not like, hey, where are you driving right now? As long as it's not on a racetrack and doesn't flag anything on our GPS, I've got no problem with where you go with the car. But after 2 weeks, hey, we're calling to schedule the pickup. No response, no response. All right, we start chewing through the security deposit. All right, maybe they'll keep it for another week. All right, bill them for that, bill them for that. Something's not right here. They didn't respond. It ended up that the car was stolen. It probably went directly from our place. Because then I'm like, give me these documents. Like, now I'm checking these guys' work, and I'm like, this isn't even a real passport. Like, she gave you a fake passport. And I'm like this documents now don't make sense, because the old magician trick, look at the lady here while I take your wallet out of your pocket. And that's effectively what ended up happening, is that they stole the car by distracting us, giving us fake documents. We got the $15,000, but then we tried to make an insurance claim on our own insurance. And it turns out it's not as easy as you think. Because when you rent a car to somebody and you give them the keys and you give them the car, it's no longer theft, it's conversion, which is that they are taking the car, and yeah, you can go after them in court, you can send them more invoices, you can keep charging their security deposit, but ultimately, like, they didn't steal the car, they just haven't returned it. And in Florida, I forget what we had to do. Was that when we were up in Delray Beach? I think we had to go send certified letters to the address on file demanding the car back, and upon not receiving responses from these certified letters, then we could ultimately call the car stolen. What ended up happening was, when we looked at the GPS was cut in the car, and that was what actually triggered us to allow us to report it as stolen, that the GPS was disabled. And ultimately our insurance company paid out on it. But it was a close one. We almost ate a GT3 because the guys weren't paying attention. And that's a valuable lesson, and it's usually the case. It's usually not that the procedures aren't there, it's that somebody cuts a corner or doesn't pay attention to the procedure, because for whatever purpose, it's just that's the risk of being a business owner, is that you rely on other people's labor and you're not doing everything as it should be done or as you would do it. The other one that we had stolen also from Florida was a Bentley GTC, and this one had different results, because this car, we knew something was up virtually instantly, because they didn't cut the GPS initially. And I saw a car that was rented in Miami beelining up the coast. And I'm like, these guys rented the car for 3 days. Where are they going? And they went up to Daytona, past Daytona. Okay, now they're in Georgia. I was like, all right, something's not right. And ultimately they went all the way to like Baltimore. And nobody rents a car for 3 days, drives from Miami in the winter to Baltimore in the winter. So we knew something was up. Then we tried getting the customer on the phone. That wasn't happening. The GPS had it listed as in a storage unit in suburbs of Maryland. And obviously we can't report it. We call the police. They're not doing anything. It's like, it's on rental. I can't do anything. It's not stolen. It's just like if a customer wants to park your car, and it's like, yes, it's abnormal, but there's no theft. There's no crime to be reported yet. So you sort of bang your head against the wall there. Then it turns out that the GPS unit was cut. We couldn't tell because it's reported as like last known location. If it goes underground, it could be underground until it comes out and gets line of sight with the sky again. But we got a phone call from, I would take it as the fall guy, because that one we did have an actual ID. And the three guys came in. We had them on security camera. We had the actual ID from the guy. And I think that guy ended up being the guy who's like, hey, we'll give you $1,000 to rent this car for us. We'll come in with you and we'll steal it. And we'll give you whatever. I don't want to assume what the terms were. But this guy calls like, hi, I'm just a good Samaritan. I want to let you know that I was at this diner and I hear these people talking about stealing your car. And I just want to be a good Jehovah's Witness. And I'm like, what? Wait, what? Like, yes, we know that car stole. Where's the car? Oh, well, I see the car is here now. And like, so I think we're like, I'll keep like, so this guy was feeding this information. And I'm assuming, oh, just if you give me a reward later. I'm like, I don't like, whatever, like help me get the car back. So then I started like calling around to like the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security. And I try to get somebody on the case here. And like, I think it was finally somebody in like the violent crimes division of like Baltimore that was finally able to get like somebody who was like, I'm bored, let's do this shit. I ended up staging a raid at this, like, he's like, oh, it's being loaded onto the container truck right now. So I had helicopters, I had like a full-blown raid. I get a call from this detective. Who the hell are you? Like, oh, we've been working like this for like ever. I'm like, look, nobody answered my call. Like, I like called you guys, I tipped you off. It's my car that's being stolen. So don't look at me like I blew some door off. Like, and they found the container full of cars. One of the cars in the container I read on the news story was like robbed at gunpoint from DC earlier that week. So it was a big international car theft ring because the container was slated to go out of Newark. And as soon as that container gets loaded up on the container ship, it's gone. It's in Africa, it's wherever it is overseas. But I was able to essentially take down a car theft ring because somebody made the mistake of stealing my Bentley. Still to this day, I get like that guy who called is in jail now, but like he calls me with his lawyer to try to get me to like be a character witness and speak on his behalf. I'm like, look, I can't control it. I can only tell you what I know. I know somebody called me up. I know somebody was tipping me off. I can't say what you were involved in, what I knew, what I didn't. I could tell you, I am not going to lie on your behalf to get you out of jail or anything. I am happy to tell any detective that wants to call me, or I can even tell your lawyer what I know, but I can't promise that's going to be helpful to get you out of jail. You've put yourself in this position and there's not really much I can do. We got the car back. There was a little bit of damage on it, but ultimately it was good to get the car back because that's another one that, like, you don't want to keep making claims on your auto insurance, especially when it's for a car theft or something like that. That's like the notorious why it's so hard to insure exotic car rentals, because a lot of times businesses don't know how to run a business. And what they'll do is they'll like build up all this depreciation on the cars. Oh, $50 a day, whatever, like renting all these rentals. And then the cars are worth nothing. And like, yeah, we paid $200,000 for that. We'll sell it for like $190. And it's worth $75 and they owe $160 on it. And like, what are you going to do? You've already spent all the cash on whatever you spent it on. The business is insolvent. The only thing you do is you take your warehouse full of cars and make them disappear or make them catch fire or something like that to make a big insurance claim and then start the process over again. And it's loss runs like that that forced a lot of the insurers, like, I don't want to touch this business. The assets are too expensive. It's too risky. Like these guys renting cars out and it's like, oh, I'm renting it to my friend and the insurance isn't proper and these cars get wrecked and then you go to make a claim on your insurance for a $300,000 car and your loss runs are, yeah, you paid $80,000 insurance, but you made $600,000 in claims this year. So it's tough.
I didn't really want to send $250,000 back just because a trucker was 2 days late. Most people, when they ship a car, they'll just call Intercity or reliable carriers or whatever. They'll get in this queue and they'll get to it when they get to it. So they might not even pick up your car for 2 to 3 weeks. And you don't know that going in, you're just waiting for a truck that's happening to go that route. So if you want something done quickly, the average consumer has to go through a broker. I, of course, have access to a special load board that allows me to get truckers directly. And that's usually when these adventures start happening because you sometimes scrape the bottom of the barrel. The brokers do not always weed out who is actually shipping the truck. They're just going with the cheapest guy because they don't really care about your car. They just take their $200 and move along. One of the most stressful ones was when I was shipping my Nissan GTR to Las Vegas from Ohio, and I had to get it there in a week because I had a big event at my dealership in Vegas and I needed it there for that because I was going to give demo rides to people on the track. So I contracted with the company and I said, I need the car there on Friday. No problem, the guy has to be out there anyway for something else. So the trucker shows up, I talk to him and I say, just to confirm, you're going to be in Vegas by Friday, right? Absolutely, yep, no problem, I will be there. You'll have your car for your event. I said, okay, because if not, don't even take the car. He loads the car, I fly out to Vegas. Wednesday rolls around, I call the company, hey, where are you at? Oh, he's in Arkansas, something like that.
Not making great time, but okay. Thursday rolls around. I say, hey, where are you at? He said, well, I broke down and I'm at this truck stop getting my truck fixed. I said, okay, where? And he said, well, I'm in, I think it was Arkansas, something like that. And he said, I'm at the Peterbilt truck stop. I said, okay, which one? I looked him up, there's two. I said, I'm gonna fly in, come find you and just drive my car back because it's a day drive, I can still make it back. And he couldn't tell me which one he was at. So I called the owner of the trucking company. I said, where's your guy? Oh yeah, he's broke down, this and that. I said, I need to know where I'm going to get my car. Couldn't give me a straight answer. So after getting a bunch of runaround, I just said, forget this. I called up the owner of the trucking company. I said, you need to tell me where your guy is at, otherwise I'm calling the Arkansas State Police and registering my car as stolen. Tell me where my car is. So turns out he was actually in Memphis. The guy decided to go home for the weekend because he's from Memphis. So he was at a Peterbilt truck stop, but not in Arkansas. He was not broken down. He wanted some barbecue. I was livid because I said, you guys guaranteed me delivery on Friday and you had absolutely zero intentions of doing this. And not only that, you as the owner of the company lied to cover up your trucker. The same thing. I said, listen, I know where he's at. I'm sending somebody by to get his license plate number and all that. And I said, I have another truck I've booked to pick up the car from him. No, we're not going to release it. You have to pay us for the shipment. I said, once again, if you don't unload that car and give it to the other trucker, I'm calling the police. My car is stolen. Okay, fine, we'll let it go. So I had a buddy of mine from Memphis go by, make sure he was actually at the truck stop and talk to the trucker. And then I had another company go by and pick my car up off that truck and take it to me in Vegas, not by Friday, but it arrived without detour. I did not pay them. Speaking of not paying, when the Porsche GT2 came out in 2008, I had one of the first ones and I sold it to a longtime good customer of mine in California. Given that he paid so much money over sticker, he wanted it right away. He deserved that. So again, I contracted with a company and said, I need the car there, guaranteed delivery by Saturday. I will pay whatever it takes to guarantee delivery because usually companies won't guarantee delivery unless you basically buy out the whole truck. No, we'll charge you regular price. We have to be there this weekend anyway for a couple of other things. And I went back and forth. I said, no, I will pay you extra. I need guaranteed delivery. And this is a big reputable company. Nope, we'll charge you normal price. The car will be there on Friday. Okay. Picked up the GT2. On its way. Friday rolls around, nothing. Can't get a hold of the company, never heard from the trucker. Saturday rolls around, still nothing. So because it's a big company, they refuse to give us the trucker's actual number. And so they're sitting there waiting for the car and we can't get a hold of anybody. Going through their, automated system, and I'm just like, this is ridiculous. So I guess the trucker finally called my customer and said, hey, I got delayed, something or other, I'll see you Monday. And the customer called me just absolutely livid. People with that kind of money, they change their mind based on their mood. And because he didn't have the car that Saturday, he wanted it to take to dinner or whatever, he was over it and he wanted to return the car. And I didn't really want to send $250,000 back just because a trucker was 2 days late. Talked him down. I said, I'm really sorry. It'll be there Monday. If you still hate it, you can send it back or whatever, but let's try to keep this deal together and, don't pay the trucker, obviously. I'll handle it with the transport company. So it got delivered Monday. He didn't pay the trucker. And so I called the company and aired my grievances and said, we're not going to be paying you because this was absolutely ridiculous. I said, listen, if you have any issues, you deal with me. They called the customer on the delivery end, tried to get money from him. They called the Porsche dealer in New York from whom they had picked up the car, who had nothing to do with any of this, tried to get money from them. Called the broker who had arranged the shipment for me, tried to get money from them. And of course, all three of them, they said, oh, well, Doug isn't paying us this and that, and so we're just trying to get paid. So they threw me under the bus and called everybody else. Ended up losing my customer in California because of this. And I don't blame him at all. I mean, it was completely unprofessional how they handled it. And in hindsight, I would have just given him the $1,500 to keep him as a customer, but I didn't think they'd pull that kind of juvenile move. I said, stop calling people. You call me if you have a problem. If you want to chase me for the money, fine, but you're not getting paid because you didn't do the job right and you didn't communicate. So a couple months go by, don't think anything more of it. Their attorney calls me, says, hey, I'm trying to get paid for this shipping job. And so I just told him the story. And you hear him on the other end of the phone just go, oh, I'm really sorry. We'll take care of this. Never heard from them again. And this is the first time in my life I've ever had a collections attorney apologize and say, oh wow, that's bad. One of the more odd things was I had a Nissan GTR delivered and I had a crispy piece of bacon just wrapped around the windshield wiper, and I'm kind of like, how did that get there? That was one of the more odd things. But I had an Audi R8 picked up one time from an Audi dealer. And they called me after it got picked up, and they're like, who the heck did you send to pick this up? I said, I don't know, I used a broker, it's an enclosed carrier, all that. They go, I don't know about this guy. And they didn't really give me many details. But the car shows up to my shop, and it was just a box truck. It wasn't even a car carrier. He didn't have E-tracks, he didn't have a loading ramp, he didn't have any. It was just a box truck and my R8 in it. And he had basically parked it at an angle, turned the wheel all the way to the right, so the front tire was wedged against one side of the box truck, and then just set the e-brake. So we had to hire a flatbed to come back up to this box truck to unload the R8. And everything ended up being fine. I mean, super sketchy, but I called this Audi dealer. I'm like, okay, you let him take the car? You should have just not let him take the car, but it ended up being fine. All's well that ends well. I was warned not to talk about it. You know, I started at 20 years old, out of my bedroom with $4,000 in my bank account, and I didn't have a backer. I didn't have a PhD, as they call. Papa had a dealer, you know. So I had to start somewhere and sell cars and work and claw my way up in the exotic car business, which is not easy to do because everybody's backed by guys with huge amounts of money. But I got an email one time from a broker that I deal with quite often, and he was looking for a Porsche 993 GT2. And he said, hey, do you know of one of these? I said, yeah, I might. So I emailed one of my collector clients. I said, hey, do you have one of these I could have? He goes, well, I have 3 of them actually. And here's the 2 that are for sale. And one of them fit the bill. So I emailed the guy back, here's the price. And literally in about 10 emails, I made a deal on my first $1 million car. And it was one of the easiest deals I had ever made. And yet it was such a milestone. After chasing so many of those elusive, you know, multi-million-dollar deals where there's 8 people and tons of moving parts and you can't actually get the VIN number on a car and all that crap, you know, in 5 emails I had sold a $1 million car. So that was pretty cool. I had secured a number of allocations for the Vesuvius Orange Range Rover Sport, which was all the rage. And I would get allocations from Midwest dealers, advertise in Los Angeles and New York City and Miami and all the hot spots, and sell the allocations. The dealers were more than happy because they sold the cars, and the customers were more than happy to pay a small premium because their Beverly Hills Land Rover was charging $20,000 over sticker. So the measly few $1,000s I was charging was a bargain. And I got to sell some cars to some very interesting celebrities and things like that. I got on the list for a ton of Nissan GTRs. And that was one of the last cars I did, because that was 2008, right before the recession. And Nissan dealers were, of course, they were just happy to sell a car. Whatever, we've got this $80,000 car. Well, at the time it was way less than that. They got this expensive car in that they get one of. They don't know what to do with it, so they're happy to sell it to me. And so I was, selling a ton of those. But I really came into my stride with the GT3s. And I had secured over a dozen allocations, #1 slots at sticker for the GT3 RS, which at the time was impossible. I mean, they made about 400 for the US, and most guys didn't get one. But I thought ahead and placed all the deposits and had contracts written in stone and all that. So the first one I sold for a whopping $40,000 over sticker. Those were the heydays, where I could literally put out no money and make a bunch of money for flipping an allocation. But not only do certain forum junkies see it as a moral evil, but also Porsche sees it as just the worst possible crime ever. So they started contacting the dealers because they all got together and said, who's this Doug person who has, 15 GT3 RSs on order, and how? So they had some corporate meeting in New York and decided that they were going to shut me down. And so they started contacting these dealers and said, hey, if you sell that car to Doug, we will pull your franchise. They were threatening dealers to pull their Porsche franchise if they sold me a car. So I started getting letters back from the dealers, refunding my deposits, this and that. I did end up getting, I think, 2 cars total out of the 15 or so that I were legally, contractually obligated to me. The irony of it was, in all of this, their reasoning for returning the deposits was, well, you can't buy it because you're planning to resell it, which is, of course, a violation of antitrust law. But I kept track of the VINs of these cars I had ordered, and almost all of them went to some lawyer in Florida or some Renless super member in New York or some PCA enthusiast DE instructor in Nebraska, who all then proceeded to put them on eBay and flip them for an enormous profit. So all the people who preached against this just did the same. But it was interesting because a high-up guy from Porsche called me and tried to trap me into admitting that I was reselling them. And I'm like, hey, yeah, I am. So what? What's it to you? And he said, well, that shouldn't be done, blah, blah, blah. And you should get a Porsche dealer. You should have a Porsche dealer. You shouldn't be allowed to sell. Nobody should be allowed to sell Porsches except us. So, nothing ever came of it other than, they kept me from making about $500,000 on flipping GT3 RSs. When Porsche said that I shouldn't be flipping cars, I said, well, I'm just fixing a problem that you guys created. You guys got your pricing and your regional distribution wrong. If you raise your prices and sent all your cars to, LA, Miami, all that, then I wouldn't exist. I'm just taking advantage of an opportunity. But they have to satisfy their dealers and, placate them and say, well, you sold so many Cayennes, you get a GT3 RS. So they haven't necessarily changed that, but what they've done is introduced stiff penalties to all these dealers saying, well, if you sell outside of your region, we're just going to fine you $5,000. So it's all just punitive now. Or like in Porsche's case, they introduced the 918 VIP program where you have to buy $1 million car, and then you get first rights to any GT car. And if you sell that car within 6 months, you get booted out of the program. So of course guys just waited for 6 months and 1 day and then flipped them anyway. And all Porsche did was turn their best VIP customers into opportunists. So they took people like me out of the picture and just put other people into the picture. And I mean, it's supply and demand. There's always going to be a way around the system.
That was not the way he was supposed to do his job, but at the very least, I had a person saying, if you give me the VINs, I can get you a title. One of the greatest parts about running VINwiki is that I get dozens of messages every day with opportunities to buy cars. And it's kind of like being in a dealership where you get faced with trades and all this stuff. But now they're really, really weird cars, and particularly cars in really, really weird circumstances. And that's the kind of thing that I really enjoy, just kind of a car that has some barrier or obstacle to purchase that would exclude most buyers or just scare them off. I got a call from a guy who had gotten my number, and he and his family have a ton of cars, and he's a real kind of dyed-in-the-wool car guy. But he had heard through a guy in Brazil about some cars. And the main car that was potentially available was a 2005 Porsche Carrera GT in paint to sample midnight blue metallic. And it was in Brazil. Now, there aren't many Carrera GTs in Brazil, and there certainly aren't many that are supposedly US cars, because most South American cars are Euro spec cars. I ended up selling a good number of cars into Brazil. We weren't supposed to as a Lamborghini dealer, but it was a fairly popular practice around 2011 and 2012. And the Brazilian currency was kind of strong, and so it made a lot of sense for them, and the tariffs or duties or whatever they had to pay bringing cars in made it really desirable to bring in US cars. But I knew that you had to take a car that was a current model year and had less than 250 miles on it for it to pass customs into Brazil and be legal to import. And so apparently when these cars went into Brazil, I think it was in 2008 or 2009, they had not been essentially in accordance with the rules set forth to properly import cars. And in fact, they had kind of been disguised. Someone had put white wrapping that looked like manufacturer wrapping on all these cars and had somehow tried to get them through. And they'd been seized by customs. And in fact, the person trying to import them, or who at least the person who had contracted a company to import them, ended up being arrested for money laundering and sentenced to 50 years in prison. In 2012, the Brazilian government had a public auction to try to auction off all the cars. And apparently, in addition to this Carrera GT, I was told there was another Carrera GT in black that actually had some miles on it. Supposedly, the blue car was delivery miles. Then there was an LP640, two 997 turbos, an FJ Cruiser, and maybe a Mustang. So there was a handful of pretty interesting cars. None of them had been run, certainly since 2012. And this person who this contact had kind of been talking to had some pictures. So we saw some pictures of some very dusty, somewhat wrapped cars sitting in a very Brazilian, middle of nowhere looking like warehouse. It looked like the place that the Fast and the Furious cast would sneak in and try to steal a bunch of cars out. So it's a fascinating idea, because what he had heard was that someone who worked in that customs house was willing to sell the cars for a storage fine. So potentially $2,000 or $3,000 per car. All right, so what would happen if we bought 5, 6, or even just one non-running exotic car in Brazil? How do you bring it in? Because if you have a car without a title, and we were being told they would be sold without titles because they were held either by the importation company or by the guy, but anyway, by someone who was never going to be able to get the cars back, but whoever was going to sell them for whatever fines or whatever, it wasn't going to go through any official channels. And this was really his question to me. All right, Ed, if we had some cars in Brazil that don't run, how do we get them here to fix them? I said, well, that's a fascinating thing. You know, you could disassemble them and ship them as parts You're allowed to sell parts across borders. We could set up a company essentially that owns them in Brazil and sells them into the US. We might have to pay some taxes or import duties, but they won't be of any consequence relative to the values of these cars. I mean, theoretically, a paint to sample Carrera GT is worth about $1 million, or maybe a little bit more with delivery miles. So even if it needs $100,000 in service to get to run, it's probably worth chasing. And so this is a good idea if we can explore it. So we could disassemble them, but we're gonna have to take a team of people down there to do that properly, at least a few really qualified, really knowledgeable mechanics. And then we've got to manage to get them across, probably in multiple loads, and not lose anything. So that was a bit of a challenge. But then you still have to figure out a way once they're here to get titles. So even if you could just drive them across the border or truck them whole across the border, you got to figure out a way to get them registered in the US. And fortunately, they were all US VIN cars. We could see pictures where the side marker lights and things like that were appropriate. And we didn't know the VINs though. We had just been told they were US cars. And so that had been our ever-ending question at VINwiki. What are the VINs to the cars? It allows us to check the history and see what they are and verify the options and that it is a paint to sample car, because all we saw was kind of a dusty, darkish colored Carrera GT. Could be a lot of things. There's two ways to get titles for cars that don't have titles, and they are bonded titles and mechanics liens. A bonded title is actually purchased through your insurance provider because it's really an insurance policy against someone else coming up and saying, that's my car, here's the title, I now own it. It would pay you back in that circumstance. But in order to get one, there has to be a VIN inspection and the car has to have kind of a proper ownership narrative. Like you have to say, I bought it from this guy and this is why we don't have a title. And the other option is a mechanics lien. So if you perform work as an authorized and licensed shop on a car and nobody pays for it, then you can put a lien on the title and you can foreclose on that lien. You can repossess the car off of that lien and take ownership. Now you have to notify all title holder parties and any companies or anything that have an interest in that car. And then in general, if you don't get a response to that through publishing things in the newspaper, you'll have a public hearing. And if nobody appears, then you do get to take ownership of the car, essentially for whatever your cost of work in it is. As I talked to people who had done this with cars legitimately, they were like, that really won't work well here. But you ask around long enough and you find someone who says, sure, I could do that. I'll get you a title for anything with a VIN. And that was not the way he was supposed to do his job. But at the very least, I had a person saying, if you give me the VINs, I can get you a title, which meant he didn't even need to have it in the US. So theoretically, we could get titles to the cars while they were still being held by the government. We still weren't exactly sure where the cars were, how this guy was getting information, and what kind of access was available. Then out of the blue, I get an email from a VINwiki fan. One of our viewers was from Brazil. And he said, you know, I've lived here all my life, got a lot of friends that are all connected. We love it here. And I was like, that's fantastic. I said, would you like to go to Sao Paulo and check out some cars? And he got really interested. And I just told him everything. And he's like, let me do some digging. And he sends me at least 10 emails through the night, does all the research, finds articles about the cars being seized, information about the auction in 2012, the VINs of everything from different listings, including sifting through to find the misspellings, because one was listed as a Porsche WP0, where they're all WP0 or WP1. And so that was awesome. We got that figured out. We were able to pull the Carfaxes and check VINwiki. And the Mercy and the Carrera GT, there was only one, both had accidents on Carfax within a day of each other, which was really, really strange. And the Carrera GT had been issued a US salvage title at one point, which also makes it harder to get another bonded or mechanics lien title in some cases, in some states. But regardless, they had both been in California, both had accidents on Carfax, and certainly had been in Brazil that long. And he was very much like, look, you know, these cars are there. We could maybe trigger a public auction, but I'm like, no, we don't want to do that. We don't want to pay what these things might really be worth, because anytime you've got a car that's in a condition where it needs a lot of work, there's always someone out there that thinks, it's not going to be that bad. I'm just going to wash the thing up, put a new battery in it, check the fluids and start it, which was 100% not the case with the Porsches or the Lamborghini. Maybe the Toyota would, but that's a terrible way to go about kind of a barn find circumstance. And so I was like, we don't really want to start that because someone's going to pay more. I mean, we know there's money to be made at, you know, a reasonable number, but there's always somebody who will buy them as is. And we'd even talked about that. Like, do you even try to fix the cars, or do you sell them dirty? You know, obviously there's been examples of barn find cars that get pushed across the block at a Gooding or RM or Sotheby's auction, and they bring a ton of money because people are just like, I want it to be exactly as it was found. And so especially with a car with this kind of a fantastic story, it might bring more money as this crazy mystery car than it would fixed up, ready to go, perfect and nice. But he said, other than that, I don't think anybody in the Brazilian government is actually going to accept a bribe and let you have these cars. And I was like, that's not what I've heard about Brazil or South America in general. And he said something like, this is not a year in the past. Like, this is not how it used to be. But that year was not long ago. It was like 2005 or 2010. Like, we weren't far removed. It wasn't 9/11. And so this brave new world of Brazilian government culture, I guess, is fairly recent. But he was very confident that we weren't going to be able to secure the cars for $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. The guy who contacted me ended up flying down there once we found out the exact location of the cars, and he had some other reason to be in South America. I don't recall why, but he was like, I'm actually going to be not too terribly far. I'm going to rent a car and go over there. And he managed to not get kidnapped, but he also did very much get stopped at the gate, and they weren't interested in taking a little bit of money from him to go check them out or take some more pictures or anything like that. So he kind of decided, and I tend to agree, it was just not really worth the effort. So it was a tremendously fun mental exercise to strategize and scheme about what type of Fast and Furious-esque or Gone in 60 Seconds style strategy would be necessary to liberate such a car in such a circumstance from such a country and bring it back home. But we couldn't really come up with anything that made enough sense to really pursue. Nothing legal, at least, and that was pretty much beyond most of my thresholds for automotive exploits. So not something I'm going to pursue, and he's kind of off of it. So at this point, I guess it's up to one of you guys. I came down off the high-speed oval, and in my rearview mirror, showing up out of nowhere like Will Ferrell in Wedding Crashers, is a local sheriff. Back in 2007, when a rental customer of mine down in South Florida blew up the motor in my first Lamborghini Gallardo, a local guy down there did me a lot of favors and helped me out a lot in trying to manage where the car was and getting it fixed and things like that. And so a few months after everything was resolved and the car was back in Atlanta, he had found the Porsche 944 Turbo that he really wanted to buy, but at the time he didn't have the money, and I really did owe him a favor, and it wasn't that expensive. I think it was $2,500. So he asked me to loan him the money to buy the car, and so I did so, and he paid me back a little bit, a few $100s, but of course, as you'd expect, he never paid me back the rest. And so years later, probably around 2010, I agreed with him that we just needed to sell the car. So he shipped it up to me in Atlanta, and I retitled it and got it sold and made myself whole on the loan. But the person I sold it to was a guy I'd known for a little while in the local Atlanta area car community, Mitch DeFrancis. And he had owned several interesting cars and had a Ferrari 308 that he's talked about here, and an M5 I'd helped him buy that was originally, I think, a Brazilian car. So a lot of cool stuff. But he bought the 944, fixed it up a little bit, drove it, and sold it. And over the years, Mitch would invite me to different cool automotive events, including a BMW meetup where I met Alex Roy for the first time in person. He was doing his book tour probably in 2007 or 8. And Mitch had organized a world record for the longest on-road procession of a single make automobile. And so it was all BMWs, and I don't know, it was hundreds and hundreds of BMWs. But Mitch wanted to do another event like that back in 2011. And at the time I was working at Lamborghini Atlanta, and so he'd invited me to come along to something he was calling the Porsche Melee. And he wanted to set the record for the most Porsches moving on track at the same time. And he called people from all over and had tons of really, really cool cars coming in, and he had a helicopter coming in to film everything. And so it was going to be a really fun thing. And so I was just kind of looking. I didn't have a Porsche at the time, but we did have a 2011 Porsche 911 GT3 RS in inventory at Motor Cars of Georgia. So I asked my boss if I could take it down there, and he was excited because, you know, as a car dealer, as a salesperson, you always want to branch out into different markets. And obviously people who have Porsches, particularly high-end ones, are, you know, always kind of interested in moving into something a little bit more exotic, a Ferrari, Lamborghini, McLaren, whatever the case may be. So I went down in this beautiful white white ceramic brake RS with red stickers and took it to the event. And it was awesome. There was sort of a concours beforehand where all the cars could kind of show off. There's some beautiful stuff, some awesome 993s, some earlier RSs, but this was kind of the newest, latest, greatest thing. So the RS I brought got a lot of attention. It was actually a really nice car to drive, but there was also a roof Yellowbird and just a whole lot of really amazing cars. In fact, I think he accumulated about 277 cars at the meetup. So when the time came to attempt the record, they had everybody kind of proceed into the track and then through the infield and kind of arranged just outside the pits. And we lined all the cars up, I think 4 or 5 wide, and they took a bunch of pictures and everybody got to kind of see all the other cars and everybody was kind of densely arranged. But obviously the goal of this was to have everyone moving on track at the same time. And they had put me with some of the other cool cars up in the front. And we had been told there were going to be a few laps around the track, some at, pretty decent speed. I was arranged, right there in the front, just sort of waiting on them to go. The car was warm, the tires were good, and, I was just kind of excited to go out on a high-speed banked track. So everybody's kind of in their cars, ready to go, and the guy who was sort of organizing, ready to kind of drop the flag, said, "Go." And I responded like a slapped thoroughbred and just blasted off in the 911 and was going around and just kind of kept blasting through gears and, had all the space in the world in the very front of the pack and got up to, 140, 150, 60. I think I hit about 170 miles an hour. And I kind of, looked as I could see towards the other side of the track and no one else was moving. And I had certainly been instructed to go and I knew that was sort of the game of the day. But as I circled around to get back to the grouping of cars, I came down off the high-speed oval, and in my rearview mirror, showing up out of nowhere like Will Ferrell in Wedding Crashers, is a local sheriff with his lights on behind me on the track. Now, I don't know where you pull over on a racetrack, but I just sort of went to the back of the procession and, rolled the window down, shut the car off. And he came up to me and I didn't really know how this was going to go. It was obviously a pretty new experience. And as you'd imagine, kind of responds with, "What do you think you're doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm driving this Porsche on this racetrack." He said, "Well, why are you driving it like that?" I said, "Well, I think that's how you drive on a racetrack." He said, "Not today, it's not." And I said, "Well, sorry." And he said, "Well, I've got to escort you off the premises now." So I was kicked off a racetrack for driving too fast in a Porsche at a Porsche track event. And it was actually a pretty good thing because even though it was a little bit of an unceremonious eviction from the track, I did need to get back up north to the dealership. So it was a good time to get out of there, and everybody enjoyed the sound and the sight of seeing me blast around, they said. Everything went okay and didn't get any more trouble on the real road, and he didn't even ask for my license or registration.